Real stories. Extreme survival. No fiction. Welcome to Stories by Candlelight.
In October of 1998, four college friends decided to spend a quiet weekend away from the noise of the city. They wanted isolation. They wanted silence. What they found instead was something that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Black Hollow Lake sat deep inside a forest in northern Michigan. No cell signal. No nearby houses. No tourists after summer ended. Just water, trees, and an old wooden cabin that locals rarely talked about. Daniel was the one who found the place. He was an aspiring filmmaker, always looking for that perfect shot, that raw, undisturbed essence of nature. He told the group it was perfect for a documentary-style camping trip. Peaceful, remote, undisturbed, he said as they drove deeper into the woods where the trees grew so thick they seemed to swallow the sunlight. The others agreed, craving the break from their studies. There was Sarah, studying psychology, always observing people. Marcus, the quiet one who preferred books to conversation. And Tyler, the skeptic who never believed in ghost stories or urban legends. They arrived just before sunset. The air was crisp, smelling of damp earth and decaying leaves. The cabin looked older than expected. The paint was peeling like dead skin, and the windows were coated in a thick layer of gray dust. But it was the carving above the heavy oak door that made them stop. In jagged, crude letters, someone had etched a warning, "Leave before the water calls." Tyler laughed, the sound echoing too loudly against the unnatural stillness of the forest. "Local legends," he scoffed, throwing his gear onto the porch. "Just something to keep the city, kids away from there. Private fishing spots." Sarah wanted to believe him. Daniel and Marcus joined in the laughter, unpacking their cameras and supplies, trying to ignore the way the cabin seemed to groan under their weight. But as the sun finally vanished, leaving them in a world of deep blues and ink-black shadows, the forest became unnaturally quiet. No crickets chirped. No owls called. There was only the sound of their own breathing and the soft, rhythmic lapping of the water against the shore. They were finally alone. They thought they wanted the silence. But as the shadows stretched across the cabin floor, they began to realize that silence has a weight. And at Black Hollow Lake, that weight was starting to feel very, very heavy. The first night began with a calmness that felt fragile, like thin ice waiting to crack. They cooked a simple dinner over a small stove, the flickering orange light of the fire dancing against the weathered wooden walls. To break the growing tension of the forest silence, they began filming short clips, laughing and sharing stories for the camera, trying to reclaim the sense of adventure they had felt during the drive. But as the clock ticked toward midnight, the atmosphere shifted. The forest became unnaturally, deathly quiet. There were no crickets, no rustling wind, not even the small scurrying sounds of nocturnal animals. It was as if the entire world had held its breath. Then they heard it. A soft, deliberate splash. Tyler stood up, his eyes darting toward the window. "Probably just a large fish," he said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. But then the splash came again. It wasn't the erratic jump of a fish. It was heavy, rhythmic, and much closer to the shore than before. Daniel grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight and stepped onto the creaking porch, the beam of light cutting through the thick, misty air. The lake was only 30 feet away, a vast expanse of black ink. The water was completely still, yet ripples were slowly expanding outward from the center, shimmering under the moonlight as if something massive had just submerged beneath the surface. "Did you see that?" Sarah whispered, her hand gripping the doorframe so hard her knuckles turned white. No one answered. They watched the ripples fade into nothingness, leaving the water like a sheet of black glass once more. Then came the third sound. It wasn't a splash this time. It was a breath. It was deep, wet, and heavy, echoing across the water with a chilling rasp. It sounded less like an animal, and more like someone gasping, for air after being underwater for too long. The sound didn't come from the woods or the trees. It came directly from the dark center of the lake. The air around them grew cold, not the natural chill of an October night, but a freezing, damp cold that seemed to seep into their bones. Daniel shut the door and locked the heavy bolt, his hands trembling slightly. They sat in the center of the room, the camera still resting on the table, its red recording light blinking like a heartbeat in the dark. They were no longer filming for fun. They were waiting for whatever was in that water to make its next move. They locked the cabin door, the heavy bolt sliding into place with a metallic click that felt far too thin against the vast silence outside. No one slept much. The air inside the cabin felt thick, as if the moisture from the lake was seeping through the wooden logs. They huddled together in the main room, listening to the house groan. At 3:17 a.m., the silence was broken. Marcus, who had been staring at the shadows in the corner, sat upright. He heard a scratching sound. It wasn't coming from the walls or the roof. It was coming from beneath the floorboards. A slow, rhythmic dragging sound, like something heavy and wet was crawling through the dirt in the crawlspace under their feet. He reached out to wake Daniel, his heart hammering against his ribs, but the moment his hand touched Daniel's shoulder, the sound stopped instantly. The cabin fell into a silence so absolute it felt deafening. Morning came with a gray, sickly light that offered little comfort, and with the light came the proof that they weren't imagining things. As they stepped out onto the porch to breathe in the morning air, Sarah let out a stifled gasp, pointing at the weathered wood. Wet footprints. They led from the dark edge of the lake across the damp grass and straight up the steps to the cabin porch. But as Sarah knelt to look closer, her blood ran cold. The footprints were human, broad, barefoot, and unmistakably clear in the morning dew. But there was a detail that defied logic. The footprints only went in one direction. They came from the water, moved toward the cabin door, and stopped right where they were standing. There were no footprints leading back to the lake. No sets of tracks showing someone had walked away. Tyler tried to explain it away, his voice cracking with a desperate kind of bravado. "Someone's messing with us," he muttered, looking toward the dense tree line. Maybe a local hunter or a hiker, but even as he spoke, he knew he was lying. There were no tire tracks on the dirt path they had driven in on. There were no boats moored anywhere on the shore. There were no other houses for miles. They walked around the perimeter of the cabin, searching for any sign of a struggle or a prank, but the soil around the rest of the building was undisturbed. It was as if whatever had walked out of that freezing water had simply vanished into thin air the moment they reached the door. The warning carved above the entrance seemed to glow in the morning light. "Leave before the water calls." For the first time, even Tyler didn't laugh. Daniel grabbed the camera, his hands shaking as he scrolled back through the footage from the night before. At first, everything looked normal. The grainy flicker of the campfire, their forced laughter, the shadows dancing on the cabin walls. But then at 12:43 a.m., the camera caught something that made the air in the room feel thin. Behind Sarah, through the dark pane of the cabin window, something pale moved past the glass. It was tall, far too tall to be a child, and its limbs were thin and elongated, moving with a fluid, sickening grace. It didn't walk. It glided across the frame, a blur of white against the obsidian forest. Suddenly, the footage glitched, a static hiss filling the small speaker for 3 agonizing seconds. When the image returned, the figure was closer. It was standing just outside the window, its face pressed near the glass. In the darkness, its eyes caught the infrared light of the camera, reflecting like the eyes of a deep-sea predator, bright, cold, and hungry. Its face was humanoid, but the proportions were wrong. The skin pulled too tight over a sharp, angular frame. Sarah stared at the screen, her voice a mere whisper. "I was sitting right there," she said. "I didn't hear a thing. I didn't feel anyone watching me." Tyler's confidence, the last shield he had against the mounting dread, finally shattered. He didn't make a joke. He didn't offer an excuse. He simply turned toward the door. That afternoon, they decided to leave. They packed their bags in a frantic silence, throwing their gear into the trunk of the car without looking back at the lake. But when Daniel turned the key in the ignition, the engine didn't roar to life. There was only a hollow, metallic click. The battery was dead. Daniel popped the hood, expecting to find a loose wire or a cold engine. Instead, he jumped back with a cry of confusion. The engine block was warm. It was radiating heat as if the car had been running for hours, even though it had sat untouched since they arrived. The forest around them seemed to lean in closer, the shadows of the tall pines stretching across the hood like long, dark fingers. They were miles from the main road. Their only way out was dead, and the sun was already beginning its slow, inevitable crawl toward the horizon. The argument started as the shadows began to grow. Panic, sharp and jagged, had finally replaced their logic. Marcus looked at the dense, darkening woods and suggested the only thing left hiking back to the main road, 6 miles through the overgrowth. But as they began to hoist their bags, Sarah froze. Her body went rigid, her eyes fixed on the obsidian surface of the water. She heard it. A whisper. It wasn't a scary sound at first. It was her own name, spoken in a tone that was soft, familiar, and almost heartbreakingly comforting. "Sarah?" It sounded like a voice from a dream, or a memory she had long forgotten. Without realizing it, she took a step toward the shore. Then another. Her boots crunched on the gravel, but she didn't seem to feel the ground beneath her. The others noticed too late. By the time Daniel reached out, Sarah had already stepped into the shallows. The water was black and freezing, but she walked into it as if she were stepping into a warm bath. It reached her ankles, then her knees. Daniel lunged forward, grabbing her arm and wrenching her back toward the bank. The moment his skin touched hers, Sarah let out a scream that tore through the silence of the forest. It wasn't a scream of fear. It was a scream of pure, agonizing pain. Her skin had turned ice cold in seconds, as if the heat was being sucked out of her body by the very water she stood in. And then they saw it. Beneath the surface, just a few feet from where Sarah stood, something moved. Something large and pale was circling her legs like a shark in the abyss. The water began to ripple violently, churning with a sudden, unnatural energy. The whisper changed. It was no longer a soft call. It was a chorus of voices, overlapping and distorted, repeating a single command over and over again. "Stay, stay, stay, stay." The sound didn't come from the air. It vibrated through the water, through the ground, and into their very bones. Daniel dragged Sarah back to the grass, her legs trembling and blue, while the lake settled into a terrifying, expectant stillness. The water wasn't just there anymore. It was watching, and it was hungry. That night, the 4 friends didn't speak. They barricaded the heavy oak door with the kitchen table and chairs, pushing their backs against the wood as if their collective weight could keep the darkness out. At 2:11 a.m., the scratching returned. But it wasn't just beneath the floorboards anymore. It was on the walls. It was on the roof. The cabin began to shake, the old timber groaning and creaking under a pressure that felt like the entire weight of the lake was pressing against the glass. The windows rattled in their frames, and then suddenly silence. A silence so heavy it made their ears ring. Marcus checked his watch. 2:17 a.m. He looked up to say something, to break the tension, but the words died in his throat. Daniel was gone. The front door, which they had just reinforced with every piece of furniture they owned, was standing wide open. There was no sound of a struggle, no splintered wood, no footsteps, just the vast, empty forest staring back at them. The air that drifted in from the lake was damp and smelled of ancient silt. They searched for hours as the sun began to bleed over the horizon, their voices hoarse from calling his name. They found nothing until they reached the very edge of the water. Half buried in the gray mud near the shore was Daniel's camera. It was still on. It was still recording. The final footage was shaky, blurred by the mist. It showed Daniel standing alone by the water's edge in the middle of the night. He wasn't running. He wasn't screaming. He was simply staring at something just beneath the surface, his face illuminated by the pale moonlight. He looked calm, terrifyingly calm, as if he had finally heard the answer to a question he had been asking his whole life. He took a single step forward, then another, walking into the dark water as if he were being invited home. The camera fell from his hand, hitting the mud at an angle, and in the final, grainy frame before the battery died, a pale, elongated hand reached up from the black ripples. It didn't grab him. It didn't pull him down. It reached out with a gentle, guiding motion, and Daniel took it. Daniel was never found. The authorities searched the lake for weeks using divers and sonar, but they found no body, no clothing, no evidence that anyone had ever been there. The case was eventually closed as a presumed drowning. But Sarah and Marcus knew better. They knew that Black Hollow Lake doesn't just drown you. It calls to the hollow parts of your soul. It waits for the silence to get loud enough, and then it offers you a way out. To this day, the locals still avoid the lake after sunset. They say that on the quietest nights, when the water is as still as glass, you can still hear the whispers drifting across the surface. They are calling names. They are waiting for someone new. Because some places aren't just haunted, they are hungry. And Black Hollow Lake is still waiting. After Daniel vanished, a heavy, suffocating silence settled over the lake. Sarah and Marcus stood on the shore, paralyzed, staring at the spot where the camera had captured that final, impossible image. The sun was rising, but it brought no warmth, only a cold, gray clarity that revealed something they had missed before. As Marcus staggered back toward the cabin, his foot slipped on a patch of loose earth near the foundation. He looked down and saw a rusted iron ring bolted to a wooden hatch, hidden beneath layers of overgrown moss and dirt. It was a cellar, but it wasn't on any of the cabin's descriptions. Driven by a desperate, illogical hope that Daniel might have been dragged beneath the cabin instead of into the lake, they pulled the hatch open. A smell hit them instantly, the scent of ancient, stagnant water and old parchment. They climbed down a narrow set of stone stairs, their flashlights flickering against walls that were dripping with a thick, black substance that looked like ink. At the bottom was a small circular room. The walls were covered in hand-drawn maps of Black Hollow Lake, dating back over 100 years. But these weren't normal maps. They showed tunnels underwater, veins that connected the lake to the very ground, beneath the cabin. In the center of the room sat a desk and on it a journal. Sarah opened it, her breath hitching. The last entry was dated only 2 days ago. The handwriting was frantic, jagged, and familiar. It was Daniel's handwriting. But Daniel had only been here for one night. The water doesn't just take your body, the journal read. It takes your time. I can see the others now. They are standing under the surface, looking up at me. They are waiting for me to complete the circle. Suddenly, the hatch above them slammed shut with a thunderous bang. The sound of scratching returned, but this time, it was coming from the stone walls around them. The black liquid on the walls began to move, flowing upward, defying gravity, as the room started to vibrate with a low, guttural hum. The darkness in the cellar felt alive, pressing against their skin like a physical weight. As Sarah and Marcus scrambled toward the stairs, the low hum from the walls transformed into a sound they recognized, the same wet, rhythmic breathing they had heard coming from the center of the lake. But now it was echoing from every corner of the small stone room. Their flashlights cut through the gloom, landing on the maps pinned to the walls. As they watched, the ink on the paper began to bleed and run, the blue lines of the underwater tunnel shifting and moving as if the lake itself were alive and rearranging its own anatomy. The drawings of the tunnels no longer looked like geography. They looked like veins, a circulatory system for something massive hidden beneath the earth. Marcus threw his shoulder against the wooden hatch, but it wouldn't budge. It felt as if a mountain were sitting on top of it. "Daniel!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "Daniel, if you can hear us, open the door." Instead of Daniel's voice, a soft splashing sound erupted from the corner of the cellar. A small pool of water began to seep up through the stone floor, black, oily, and freezing cold. Within seconds, the water was at their ankles. It wasn't just flooding. It was rising with a terrifying intent. Sarah grabbed the journal, shoving it into her jacket. As she did, a photograph fell out from between the pages. She shone her light on it and felt her heart stop. The photo showed the front of the cabin, but the date printed in the corner was 1924. Standing on the porch were 4 people. They weren't strangers. Even through the grain of a century-old photograph, the faces were unmistakable. It was them. Daniel, Sarah, Marcus, and Tyler, wearing clothes from a different era, but with the same eyes, the same expressions, the same terrified realization. "We've been here before," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling so hard she could barely speak. "Marcus, look at the photo. This isn't the first time we've come to this lake. We're part of it. We've always been part of it." The water was now at their waists, the coldness numbing their limbs. The black liquid on the walls began to take shape, forming long, pale fingers that reached out toward them. The hum in the air grew into a roar, 1,000 whispers screaming at once. The lake wasn't just hungry for their lives. It was hungry for their history. It was a loop, a trap that had been resetting itself for 100 years. And the hatch above them wasn't just a door, it was the mouth of the beast, finally closing. The water continued to rise, reaching their chests, pulling the warmth from their lungs. Just as the black liquid threatened to submerge them entirely, the pressure on the hatch snapped. With a violent jerk, the wooden door swung open, but it didn't lead back to the cabin. Sarah and Marcus pulled themselves up, gasping for air, only to find themselves standing on the shore of the lake. But it wasn't the morning they had left behind. The sky was a bruised, eternal purple, and the cabin was gone. In its place stood a circle of ancient, rotting wooden pilings, like the skeletal remains of a pier that had vanished decades ago. "Look," Marcus choked out, pointing toward the center of the lake. The water was transparent now, glowing with an eerie, bioluminescent light from deep below. Beneath the surface, they could see hundreds of figures. They weren't floating like corpses. They were standing on the lake floor, looking up. Among them was Tyler, his face calm and vacant, and Daniel holding his camera, still filming the world above. They weren't dead, they were preserved, held in a state of silent underwater purgatory. Suddenly, the figures began to move in unison, their hands reaching upward toward the surface. The whispers returned, but this time, they didn't come from the water. They came from inside Sarah's own head. "The circle must be completed," the voices echoed. 4 came to the water. 4 must stay in the water. Sarah looked at her hands. They were becoming pale, the skin turning translucent like the figures below. She looked at Marcus and saw the same transformation. The lake wasn't just a place. It was a collector of moments, a thief of time that fed on the souls of those who sought its silence. With a final, desperate surge of will, Sarah grabbed a heavy stone and smashed Daniel's camera, which she was still clutching. As the lens shattered, the vision of the underwater world flickered like a dying television screen. The purple sky cracked, and for a split second, they were back in 1998, standing on the muddy shore in the pouring rain. They didn't look back. They ran until their lungs burned, leaving their car, their gear, and their friends behind. They reached the main road by midday, half dead and babbling about monsters in the water. Years later, Sarah still wakes up in the middle of the night, feeling a phantom chill in her bones. She never goes near the water, not even a swimming pool or a bathtub, because she knows the truth. The police never found the cabin. When they searched the coordinates, they found only an empty forest and a lake that seemed smaller, shallower, and perfectly ordinary. But sometimes when she's very quiet, she hears a soft splash in the distance. She knows that Black Hollow Lake is still out there, hidden between the folds of time. It is patient. It is eternal. And it is still waiting for the two who escaped to come back and finish the story. Because once the water calls your name, it never